Hello, this is Dr. Vaughn Crichlow here, and I'd like to take some time to answer questions that I didn't get a chance to at the end of my presentation on the impossible mandate. So let's get into the questions. First one, how do you infer what took place in Minneapolis as being primarily racially motivated? Well, I never stated that it was racially motivated. On the slide, what I indicated was cases of perceived injustice. And perceptions are extremely important. And the context that I laid out in terms of how community perceptions have worked, particularly in urban neighborhoods with predominantly Black residents, that there are feelings of hurt. And when these incidents occur, they impact people in a particular way, depending on the cognitive landscape in which they live. And so perhaps this question misunderstands or does not take into account the areas in which people live and the types of experiences that they have with the authorities and the way in which they perceive the authorities. But I never inferred that this was racially motivated. As a matter of fact, I tend not to get into what the individual motivations of officers or actors or practitioners within the system are. We're more concerned about trends and the ways in which certain policies impact groups, sometimes in a disproportionate way. Next one. Do Black Americans want more or less police in their communities? It's a good question. I cannot answer that question. I have not done a national survey of what Black Americans think about police in their local communities in regard to whether they need more or less. However, there's a subtext to that question that I think is relevant to the discussion about the types of reforms that should take place. Community voices are extremely important, and we need to really be careful about the types of reforms that we're calling for, particularly if the people calling for reforms don't even live in those communities that are impacted. And so local communities need to have a voice in the types of reforms that take place within their communities. That's extremely important. Next question, what is concentrated disadvantage? Concentrated disadvantage is a term that pertains to the ways in which poverty and factors that are related to poverty, particularly in America's urban areas, the ways in which they create certain disadvantages for people, the ways in which joblessness, so not just unemployment, but joblessness in terms of those that are not even looking for jobs. And there are various reasons why that might be the case. Underfunded schools, high school dropout rates, teenage pregnancy, and all of these things. And again, moving into aggregates in terms of not just looking at individual circumstances, but aggregates. What it does is that in terms of the stats, when you look at people that come out of situations in which there's overlapping or incremental disadvantages due to economics and due to access and all of these issues, that it impacts the outcomes in terms of the trajectory of their lives. And again, we're talking about trends in terms of overall trends and how living in such communities, particularly as in terms of the impact on children and their development, makes concentrated disadvantage a very important subject. And it kind of takes us beyond just talking about poverty or being poor, but what are the disadvantages that are connected to living in these areas? Next question, a lot of details like what are left out, preventing us from understanding use of force incidents. So when use of force data is publicized, you have to ask yourself, with these event summaries, are there missing demographic details, first of all, in terms of the race of the officer, Sometimes the race of the civilian, the type of crime that was being investigated, whether or not the civilian resisted arrest, all of these factors, whether there were shots fired at the scene by others in the community, these types of things, that there are all of these different factors that sometimes don't make their way into an event summary. And so these details make it very difficult. In addition to that, there are a lot of examples of use of force, the majority where no one dies, where there isn't a fatality. And we don't know enough about this. And this is extremely important when talking about use of force. Most people don't die in their interactions with police. And so it's important to have that context and have comparison groups so that we can get at the characteristics as to what is it about these cases which lead to the death of individuals, and then break down according to race, if race is applicable at all, and if there are significant differences. And just let the data speak for itself. So, you know, those are some of the implications of leaving out details. Can you expand on how urban poverty leads to crime, not just to theft, which might be somewhat related to need, but to violence apart from theft? Oh, this is a misunderstanding of how poverty impacts crime. Poverty does not cause individual criminality, in that being poor doesn't make somebody a criminal. Being poor doesn't make someone steal. So this idea of not just theft, being poor doesn't make someone steal. If that were the case, then all of the corporate crimes and theft and the stealing of people's futures, would make absolutely no sense, because most of those folks who commit those crimes, they are not poor. And those are examples of theft. So it's really a question of the environments that are created in certain areas where there's a lot of poverty, and all of these factors that tend to be correlated with poverty, okay? These create a landscape or a community that is under stress and is broken. And when communities are under stress and broken, what happens is that the criminal element within those communities, which tends to be a minority of people, okay, they now have an environment in which they can perpetuate certain types of behavior. And what it does, it creates a feeling of hopelessness, because who are their victims? Their victims are people within those communities. And so children growing up in those spaces, what happens is that their feelings of, well, no one cares about me. I can't succeed. And what happens, they start to look at the ways in which adulthood, or in the case of boys, the ways in which masculinity is defined within their communities. And guess what? They learn how to be criminals and such, or they learn how to engage in criminality. Don't want to call them criminals per se, but how to engage in a life of crime. So context matters. Next question, when civilians have been compliant, or when Blacks have been compliant? I'm not sure what that pertains to. I don't understand the question. Was Jacob Blake complying with the officers? Again, I'm not commenting on individual cases. I don't even believe all of the evidence of this case has come out, but certainly it's created. And again, you know, the way in which social media functions and the sharing of these videos, it makes an impact on people. And that's the point I was making in terms of perceptions. I don't know if he was complying or not, and I'd rather not comment on that. Is stop, question, and frisk useful? Well, there are some officers that believe that it's necessary. And I could see the usefulness of where probable cause arises to make a search. And so, you know, the Constitution there are protections in regard to what is a reasonable search and such. So this is certainly a question that's up for debate. One of the big issues is the way in which SQF has been utilized, particularly in low-income communities. And as I said in the presentation, there were constitutional challenges in New York City and other parts of the country in regard to the use of these types of tactics. I know we have a terrible problem here with discrimination, disproportionately arresting and incarcerating. I'm that much more disheartened to know it's as prevalent in other countries. I was hoping we were an outlier. I wonder if this is different from the 1950s when Nina Simone, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, etc. became expats in France. Wow, well, I'll need to study France a whole lot closer to understand what is happening there over time, but I did draw these references to show that the US is not alone. Thanks for pointing that out. I would encourage further study. Next question. How does a police union contribute to a bad policeman getting into a different police agency? So there's been a lot of back and forth in terms of the role of not just unions, but police fraternities, federations, and the ways in which officers are protected and are not held accountable. And sometimes within those frameworks, what you have is officers being let go of from one agency and in not facing any consequences for misconduct, sometimes enabled by the unions within those particular contexts, that they are rehired by other agencies. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of police unions helping police officers to get into another agency. I never stated that in the presentation, but certainly unions are part of this picture. Dr. Crichlow, what do you think about President Trump's executive order on gender and sex stereotyping and the effects that will have on education and funding from governmental agencies? Essentially, his executive order states that federal agencies and entities who receive federal funding can no longer teach or train people on sex and racial stereotyping. I don't want to weigh in on the current politics, particularly in an election year. However, I will say that when we look at the school curricula, there have been criticisms of the way in which K through 12 has addressed issues pertaining to race, pertaining to gender, pertaining to issues of discrimination, pertaining to bullying, pertaining to hate crimes and those types of things. And so I think that, you know, children are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. And if we present a reasoned, thoughtful, age-appropriate discussion about pros and cons and concerns regarding these issues and give them the proper education in the history, I think they can figure things out for themselves. And there are ways to do it without indoctrinating students or giving them information that would be harmful to them. I think there's a way to do it. What do the present crime rates look like in Stockton and Camden? Have the police reforms resulted in lower crime? I can't make a causal link between the police reforms and lower crime. In Stockton, crime has fluctuated. Recently, there's been a decrease in overall crime between 2019 and 2020. I can't attribute that to police reform. There are a whole lot of other factors that have to be looked at. In Camden, Camden has been celebrated as an example of how police reform can work. Certainly, when we look at the last decade, there has been a huge reduction in crime in Camden. Camden used to be the most violent city in the country, and it no longer is. So there certainly are some good and important things going on there, and I would encourage further study on that. Shared values between police and community members and criminals, or do criminals not exist? Oh, this is a sarcastic comment. I'm not going to respond to that. Are none of your recommendations in play right now? Many of them are not. And there is a lot of a start and stop in terms of the ways in which policies have been implemented. And this is one of the problems that we face. How do you spread the behavioral health model of policing from one-offs to widespread adoption across the country? That's a huge challenge. I think I addressed it at the end of the presentation when I got in an answer to one of the questions the moderator asked. Yes, it is, this is really difficult, but, we need to encourage collaboration amongst agencies. I think this is a path toward the future in sharing among counties. As I said prior, there is some precedent for this in terms of Palm Beach County and Broward County working together, particularly in the aftermath of the Parkland shooting. We've seen some collaboration. And in terms of a behavioral health model, I think that evaluation is the first step, that whatever new models are tried, they need to be evaluated. And if successful, the results emanating from those models need to be exported. So we need to promote those things better. And so the way in which we communicate those findings, we definitely need to look at that. Question, what is a co-production of public safety? Simply the community being involved in whatever decisions are being made when it comes to reform of public safety, that the community being a part of these conversations. Question, would that make a difference? Oh, years ago, tasers were more popular as an alternative to deadly force. What do we know about their use today, and what would that make a difference in the number of fatal encounters? Well, I'm not an expert in the tasers research. Certainly, they are part of the discussion of the use of force. There are issues. There are issues with the use of tasers, as you know, depending on the health of the individual, the civilian. It could be fatal to them. So a taser is still a weapon, and whatever training the police receive, tasers, like guns, need to be part of that training. And I believe in most agencies that is the case. But in terms of what we know about the use today, I'll have to look into that some more. How this can be used to make it global with other groups of color or racial profiling. I'm not too sure what that question is, but it sounds like there is a need for collaboration. Indeed, politicians need to be on board to make this happen, and that is really a tall ask, but we can't be discouraged. We have to keep trying. Why is there a need for fundamentally, drastically changing the policing profession? I never said that there's a need for fundamentally, drastically changing the policing profession, but I did talk about unhealthy cultures, and there are ways to do that. I believe that that's extremely important, and I laid it all out in the presentation. What steps to have our youth not be scared of police? They also notice what you have shared. I'm not too sure that question, but it perhaps has to do with education. There's an education piece here in terms of helping our youth to understand the role of police and that they're actually not the enemy. That burden should rest heavily on police as well in terms of reaching out to community members and being a part of community discussions. And there are many agencies that have been working with youth in terms of having a sports league, having a shop with a cop and these types of events to ensure that the whole mythology around policing, where the youth are concerned, is removed, so that a child would have a positive interaction with a police officer, such that the only time you see a police officer wouldn't be when you've done something wrong or someone close to you has done something wrong. And I believe that's really important. How are the policemen, women, mentality towards race and economics change if society in general cannot accept differences in race and economics? Are police officers not products of that society? That's an excellent question that certainly we cannot talk about policing culture or the beliefs or definitions about society that police hold on to without talking about the larger society, because police are not aliens. They didn't just come from somewhere else. They come from the community. And so whatever problems are in society, whatever problems are in the community, the police are going to have those problems too. And that's an excellent point. It's very difficult. The answer to that question is obviously beyond policing. It has to do with the very fabric of society itself in terms of how we are advancing in the way in which we perceive each other, how we are advancing in terms of change, and whether or not society is handling change as well. And so I guess it takes really bold leadership on the part of police leaders as well as leaders in the community in order to have change in terms of the thinking, in terms of how people think about life in general. And the willingness of maybe older practitioners to see how they can work with the younger ones who are maybe more on top of some of these changes, particularly the technological ones. And I think the older generation can teach the younger generation a few things, but certainly the younger generation can learn a lot. The older generation, I should say, can learn a lot from the younger generation. I think that's really important. It appears that we need a major reallocation of funds rather than defunding within the police departments to support a public health approach. Who ultimately makes the decisions on budgets and spending? How can or how should we as community members support change? Wow, there's several questions there. In terms of who ultimately makes the decisions, I believe that what would be useful would be a public referendum within a community following an awareness campaign about what the issues are and educating the public on what those issues are, and having the community vote on a number of options could be a model in terms of getting, or a way of getting or eliciting community feedback, which could be really helpful when it comes to the decision-making bodies, when it comes to our local representatives and such, in terms of the people that we actually vote into office when it comes to making decisions about budgets. But you cannot do it. You cannot make these decisions without the expertise of those that work closely in these areas. So you gotta have police, you gotta have health officials involved in this process, and it needs to be transparent. But that's really, it's a difficult path. Defunding, it has a lot of political connotations, and so and I know that many cities have limited resources, and so how do you do that that's probably that's probably going to be a question that's going to really define whether or not we're successful in really having the collaborations that we need in our communities. And in terms of community members supporting change, as I had said before, we can have community events. Why not get together and take collective action regarding having community events where the community can discuss these things in an orderly fashion, and invite public officials to those meetings to listen in. Kind of turn the whole format such that it's not the public officials and police lecturing the community, but the community getting to talk to them and have a conversation. And I think that a lot of things could be achieved out of that substantively, but perhaps even more importantly, in terms of really building that relationship between police and the public officials and community in terms of building legitimacy, that's huge. And that would take us a huge step forward from where we are now. So thanks very much. Thank you for the questions, the engagement, and I encourage you to keep on studying, keep on exploring these issues.